There are merits to all the official King Kong movies, and by the official King Kong movies, I mean the original 1933 version, the 1976 version, and the 2005 version, respectively. I know there are tons of others, but I'm talking about the movie specifically titled King Kong, to which tell roughly the same story. But ultimately, there are two elements that can make an interpretation of King Kong work. One is Kong, the other is Anne. And they both become one and the same, really. Without Anne, there wouldn't be Kong. Without Kong, there wouldn't be Anne. This video may sound like I'm bashing the original movie, the one made in 1933. I want to make it clear right now, right from the get-go, that that isn't the case at all. King Kong 33 and King Kong 05 are literally my two favorite films of all time. I cannot pick between the two. While the original introduced me to filmmaking being more than just, something that just happens and appears out of nowhere, the 05 version, which I saw only after being a big fan of the original movie, made me realize that for good and for bad, this is what I want to do for a living. I want to make movies for a living, and that's exactly what I have done. The original film is a masterpiece of visual splendor, pacing, simplistic storytelling, and a score that to this day is unbelievably catchy and unbelievably good, while the 05 version is an epic, a true tragedy in every sense of the meaning. And this tragedy is ultimately why I think Kong and Anne's relationship and Peter Jackson's, well, quite frankly, his love letter to the original movie, is the best interpretation of said relationship. This takes what Lorenzo Semple Jr. did when he was formulating the 1976 remake and he was writing the script for that, and perfected it. There's no semblance of sexual curiosity or undertones of sexual desire in the 05 version. Instead, to quote the reviewer up from the depths, Peter Jackson's Kong develops a friendship with Anne, not an infatuation, thus taking away any of those awkward undertones we see in this version's predecessor. And this change is felt almost immediately from the first time we see Anne get carried off into the jungles to the last scene with the two of them together on top of the Empire State Building. However, before we actually dive into a breakdown of their relationship, I want to say something that immediately put Kong 05's Kong-Anne relationship above all the others, and it's something that becomes realized not until after the movie ends. While the original film plays out as a simple adventure story of a film crew finding an island a la The Lost World, there didn't need to be much undertone added to Anne, or Kong for that matter, for the movie to succeed in what it was doing. But Kong 33 isn't a period piece. Kong 05 is. So there's some basic historical setup needed for not just the characters, but we, the audience, as well. Now, me knowing a lot about the Great Depression, and I know how much it sucked, it didn't really need much explaining for me to understand it, even when I was younger. But for general audiences, yes, it needed some explaining, which is why I love the opening few scenes establishing New York and what she does. Now compare that to the original, where the first time we meet her is the famous snatching of the apple scene. We don't need to be shown that she's fallen on hard times because, well, basically everyone had fallen on hard times, even those in the audience watching the movie. But in 2005, such a thing would not be as clear. Diverting back to Kong and Anne, these opening scenes establish just how alone Anne Darrow is as a human being. She has Manny, but Manny is leaving to try to find a job elsewhere. In fact, it is Manny who is trying to encourage Anne to try out for that role written by Jack Driscoll. A good way to establish not just Anne's fascination with acting, but also her infatuation with Jack, even before we even meet him. This is a true basic reversal from that of the original film. But we'll get more into Jack a little later, because I have a few things to say about him, because, his role is key in understanding Kong and Anne. It's not like we could ignore his role in the whole picture. We just can't do that. Now, because of this loneliness and desperation, Anne is immediately a sympathetic character. Immediately. Again, this is contrasting the original, where Fay Wray didn't play Anne as sympathetic. No, instead she played her as an extremely bright-eyed and bushy-tailed person, which not only rubs off on all the characters and the crew of the venture, but also the audience as well. You immediately like the original Anne Darrow. And the same with Anne in the 2005 remake. Just in a different and a little bit more of a relatable way. While the original, we take a liking to Anne because of her bubbliness, just as the Venture crew does, etc., etc., etc. Now, enough about that, but this plays strongly into what I stated earlier about the kinship between Beast and Beauty here. To contrast this with the 76 remake, where Dwan ultimately feels sympathy for Kong, but no real understanding of him. In Peter Jackson's version, we know that not only does Anne understand Kong, but Kong also understands her in some ways, or, the best an animal possibly can. And this is why their relationship works in this version more than all the others. So let's actually break it down now. Enough rambling, let's actually break this down. Now, it becomes clear that Kong has had many others sacrificed to him. In fact, that's one of the things that 05 does in droves, is its world building, and this is another example of this. Nothing had to be said, it is shown. He ultimately kills off his sacrifices, basically, on that cliff, and Lumpy calls it a bleeding boneyard, and this is where the first shift in Kong and Anne's relationship begins. Because Anne, not worshipping Kong as a god like all the others, she actually manages to fight back. Now, this version of Anne stabs Kong with her necklace, momentarily setting her free. Now, of course, she runs, because, who the hell wouldn't? Kong's not just surprised by Anne's, actions here, but he's doubly shocked when he hears people coming after him. So for a while, Kong is contemplating, and I can confirm this as being so because Peter Jackson said so himself in that great audio commentary he did on the extended cut of the movie. He says, and I'm paraphrasing here basically, Kong doesn't know what to make of Anne. He doesn't know what to make of her. He would have killed her. No ifs, ands, or buts, he was going to kill her. Her blonde hair didn't matter. But suddenly he finds himself powerless to her despite being so much bigger and stronger. Peter Jackson shows this not through dialogue, which is what makes it so good. Or, Anne talking to Kong like we'd see in the 76 version. But instead, it's completely through visual means. The rage in Kong is that of a true wild animal. But notice how he doesn't kill her. Instead, Kong in his rage destroys everything else around her. But not her. Literally, everything else around them, but not her. And it backfires, because through his anger, it causes a rock to hit him on his back, knocking the wind out of him. And for a brief moment, Kong is vulnerable. And for the first time, we see a different side to Kong. He's embarrassed. But that embarrassment slowly changes into confusion. Why wasn't he able to kill her like all the others? And he runs off in his confusion, leaving Anne to her own devices. Now, of course, he follows her, keeping tabs from a distance and stuff, watching her and stuff, because the moment she needs help, Kong is there to save her ass, and he does so in a spectacular fashion with that V-Rex fight. And this scene, holy shit. I remember the seats shaking in my theaters, and I was just totally swept away. But it's not just an action scene, this V-Rex fight. It adds to the story itself. Anne realizes Kong just protected her. And I love how she backs up into him, went between Kong and the remaining V-Rex. And I love how Kong turns his back on her and puffs out his lower chin, as if to say, yeah, I just did that. No big deal. As if, he was trying to impress her. And he also refuses to look her in the eye, which is a very masculine thing to do. To be like, yeah, I saved you. It's just another day here on Skull Island. But when he walks away, she calls for him, and he grabs her and plants her on his shoulder. The shot, composed by the director of photography, Andrew Lesney, is genius here. Because not only do we see Anne realizing that she needs Kong, and that Kong won't ultimately hurt her, We also see Kong's eyes light up with absolutely pure glee, though he tries to hide it in his face, something that we'll actually see towards the end of the movie. We'll see that come up again later. Now, for every Kong, we need a human counterpart, a counterweight to Kong. In the case of King Kong, it is Jack Driscoll, which presents in itself somewhat of a dilemma on a dramatic standpoint for basically dictating who are we going to be rooting for here. The decision to make Jack Driscoll a screenwriter in the '05 version is, and not the first mate like the original, is a blatant attempt to address this potential problem. While in the original, it's clear that Jack Driscoll, aka John Driscoll, depending on who names him in that movie, he's our macho hero who helps defeat Kong and get the girl back. And that's a very 1930s thing. You had those type of heroes all the time in the 1930s. And that's not me judging the original at all. It works in that particular telling of the story. Kong is the antagonist of the original. No ifs, ands, or buts. He's a monster we should fear, but nevertheless we feel sorry for in the end. But all this changes when you start adding more nuance and sympathy for Kong himself. Suddenly we're not hoping Jack gets the girl. Instead, we've seen a shift in this relationship. Now we want to see Kong be okay and happy, and seeing him with Anne, that's a shift. And seeing him with Anne suddenly makes this monster not a monster at all, but a misunderstood and tragic beast our hearts go out to. Nevertheless, Kong remains macho and driven, a true wild animal. So the problem becomes having two macho male characters competing for the main role. Who do we root for in the end? Jack getting the girl back, or Kong protecting the girl and finding a kinship? And even Fay Wray, the original Andero, seemed to understand this shift in dynamic. She knew people would be sympathetic towards Kong at the end. She knew it. And why she often refused to take part in much Kong memorabilia or affairs after its release, I was so pleased to find out how much she really liked Naomi Watts when they met just before filming the '05 version began. In fact, Peter Jackson recalls a story that just tugs at my heart, that he says that Faye put a hand on Naomi and said, "Andero's in very safe hands, my dear, very safe hands." She even understood that Kong had to become and is more than just a special effect or a monster on the loose. Kong is a tragic being. The story itself is tragic. Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, and Philippa Boyens, and a few others admittedly, made a truly genius decision, and they took this potential problem totally away. They made Jack Driscoll a mere screenwriter, making the first mate someone else entirely, thus taking much of the macho-ness away from our leading man. So now, this butting of heads and clash of who do we root for is dealt with even before we even see Kong himself. Some would argue that this change made Jack in the '05 version to be a much weaker character, and I mean that no pun intended, in that his sudden growth to be an action hero comes too quick in a movie that is nearly 3.5 hours long. Now, despite this movie, in full disclosure, being my favorite film of all time, I actually would agree with this sentimentality. I would have had, played up the angle that Jack is scared, terrified even. He's way out of his element here. But it's his love for Anne that keeps him going. I would have probably made him a little bit more like Bruce Baxter, in all seriousness. Kind of scared and timid, the difference being that Jack Driscoll is not a coward like Bruce Baxter. And the scene that finally establishes that Jack is not only changed, but his bravery and dedication finally comes to fruition is after the spider pit scene, where he climbs back up the cavern on the opposite side as the others. Now, this would also parallel Kong's character in many ways. Well, not so much parallel, but contrast Kong's character in many ways. Because in many ways, that is what we get. And please don't get me wrong, that they do sort of parallel each other. But they're sort of charging at each other like freight trains. While Kong starts off as a loud and angry character, and nearly killing Anne on more than one occasion, Jack starts off as a quiet and shy, quite frankly, a weakling. And then these two freight trains just come colliding towards each other, and Kong becomes the gentle and even kind and nurturing. I mean, there's one shot where he's literally cradling Anne as she falls asleep in his arms on top of Kong's lair, and I never really noticed that before until this viewing. I was like, that's fucking adorable, and I don't care what anyone said. To contrast that, Jack becomes a hardened man surviving Skull Island's worst creatures to get Anne back. And I love how Kong sees Jack as the villain here. Not that Jack is the villain, but Kong sees him as the villain, because of course he would. Anne is kicking and screaming as Denim lays forth his trap, and she's yelling and hollering. Of course Kong would say, "They're hurting her, I must protect her," because that was his entire essence throughout the movie so far. And this is where I adore Peter Jackson's interpretation of Kong. He's kind of like a loyal guard dog protecting what is, in essence, his owner. Anne owns Kong, which goes truly into the entire theme of the movie, to which both the original and Carl Denham in the remake remark, "And lo, beast looked upon the face of beauty, and beauty stayed his hand. And from that day forward, he was as one dead." And while not actually an Arabian proverb, but something Marion C. Cooper thought of, it's nevertheless extremely poignant here. And it's also beautifully simple. Because in fact, this quotation sums up the tragic nature of not just the movie, but almost every other interpretation of Kong himself, period. Now, unlike the original, where it's clear that Anne gets with Jack and they'll probably live happily ever after, in the '05 version, I really adore how Jack seemingly knows he's fucked up. While they may have been happy at one time, Kong has changed all that. And unlike in the '76 version, where Dwan and Jack literally have to say that out loud for us to kind of understand it, in the '05 version, it is said in metaphor, the actions being portrayed in Jack Driscoll's comedy Cry Havoc. And immediately, he knows that even if they don't love each other in the end, things are worth fighting for. And he goes after her anyways. He sort of teaches himself his own lesson. His play reflects his own mentality and is teaching him what he actually should do and not just writing it down. Which that ultimately parallels Anne's view of Kong in many ways. Because, let's jump back for a bit. When Kong is captured, writer Fran Walsh apparently cringes at seeing Kong nearly passed out and reaching out for Anne, basically pleading her to just crawl back into his hand one last time. But I have to agree with Peter Jackson and Philippa Boyens on that sequence, because it brings about basically the second shift in Kong and Anne's relationship. Anne looks away. She can't bear seeing Kong like this, and has to look away. Despite him protecting her and saving her, she could not do the same for him, and looked away. And the utter hurt and confusion in Kong's eyes just before he actually passes out and goes under is enough to tug on the heartstrings of even the manliest of men. I don't care what you say. But Peter Jackson specifically put this moment in to go hand in hand with the climactic battle on top of the Empire State Building, in which we'll get to that a little later. This third and final shift with Anne and Kong happens in New York after Kong's rampage, which is beautifully done, by the way. I love how Kong is desperately looking for Anne, as if he's looking for any semblance of familiarity in a world that is totally alien to him. And he's scared. It is quite clear that Kong is scared, and he's acting like any wild animal should. He's acting out. And when he sees Jack, that anger in his eyes. You did this. You are why I am here. You hurt Anne, you hurt me. And I love it. To me, this is pure cinematic gold here in the best possible way. This final shift in Anne and Kong's relationship begins when Anne finds Kong and calms him down, which brings up something I just adore to no end. While all the other versions have it where Kong somehow finds Anne Darrow in New York City, which would be, nearly impossible the more you really look at it, Peter Jackson has it where now Anne is the one to find Kong. It inverts the trope. And from a logical standpoint, it actually makes far more sense. After all, it'd be easier to find a giant gorilla in New York City than a giant gorilla finding one specific woman in New York City. Anyway, Anne has truly tamed Kong in this moment. And I love how you can clearly tell what Kong is thinking as she walked towards him. Is it her? It is. Can I trust her? I'm going to, and I'm so happy, but I can't show it. Again, it all ties into this masculine undertone that all versions of King Kong have. And all this leads to the final scene between Kong and Anne, where Anne looks up at him, and in his eyes, And I'll be honest, it's my favorite shot in the movie, and it's so simple. You can see that Kong knows that his time is limited. He's done. The king has been toppled from his throne, and storms up to the top of the Empire State Building and does everything she can to protect Kong one last time, and it works. She couldn't protect him before, she's going to try her damnedest to do it now. The planes get driven off, but it's ultimately too late. Kong is all but dead anyways. So this time, unlike on the beach where she had to look away, Anne specifically doesn't. She watches Kong die. She literally sees the light go out as Kong dies and falls from the top of the Empire State Building. And for a split moment there, according to Peter Jackson in the audio commentary, you almost believe, that she can go over with him. But who is there to pull her back into reality? Oh yeah, it's Jack Driscoll. And the look they have towards one another isn't what you'd basically expect. A lesser movie made by a lesser filmmaker would make them dash towards each other, kiss, and la-di-da, everything is all right with the world. But here is a significant amount of more nuance to this ending, where their glances are ones of familiarity, that these two people have seen and gone through the same things, and even if they don't love each other in the end, at least for now, they are here for each other. And instead of a kiss, there is a hug. And in that hug is something I find more powerful and full of love than any kiss or even words could have possibly displayed on a movie screen. So there are two things that can make or break a King Kong movie. One is Kong himself, and the other is Ann Darrow. While the original movie is a masterclass of get in and get out cinema, with the best pacing I can truly think of in a movie, Peter Jackson's 05 remake takes that simple and effective story and transplants it into the modern era moviegoer. Some may say it's overbloated, to which I always reply, it ain't no Hobbit trilogy. And now, all jokes aside, both the 33 and 05 versions of Kong are my favorite films of all time, and all I can say is that if Peter Jackson made a 10-hour movie of King Kong with these characters, this cast, this characters, I would be involved, I'd watch it, and I'd love it. In fact, I love these movies so much, I have a hard time talking about them. Because while I hate using the term I feel, and prefer thinking about something rather than feeling it, these movies are almost pure emotion for me. And I would say that about these movies more so than any other movie that, I'd throw on my top 5 list, hands down, even the original Godzilla. And what truly sold these emotions? What truly made me sit back and go, wow, King Kong 05 changed my life? It's Kong and Ann Darrow. Their relationship is truly what makes King Kong 05 an utter masterpiece of modern cinema, and a film that not just has the right to stand side by side with the original movie, but can proudly boast made Kong live for a whole new generation of filmmakers, because I am that generation. Kong 05 was and is my Kong. So while some may say, this video is just me fangasming, my response will be, of course it is, dummy. It's my favorite film of all time. Now go on Facebook to get all up-to-date information of what AN Productions is doing. All of the social media is in the description below. Make sure to hit the subscribe button. And in the end, this is Adam Noyes of AN Productions saying, sayonara.